Welcome to Military Analytics. Have you ever witnessed an international aggressive chess challenge before? In fact, since February 24, 2022, we have all been looking at this challenge very closely. In the center of Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, the USA, China, Baltic countries, European actors, the UK, and especially ex-Soviet countries that have made historical decisions against Moscow in the last days are included in the chess fight. We're talking about the big moves made by countries such as the Czech Republic, Poland, Finland, Belgium, and the Netherlands against Russia, both in the economic and military fields, draws attention. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are trying to implement an unbelievable chess strategy against Russia, together with their allies, in order to regain their freedom and drive the Russians out of their country. While Kiev is the star in this struggle, the USA, which has provided approximately $50 billion of military support to the Ukrainian army from the beginning of the war until today, is almost the fortress of the Kiev administration. In other words, in order to withdraw the Ukrainian leader Zelensky from this war, the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, must first disable the U.S. the castle of the Kiev administration. So far we can see that this will not be possible for Russia. But Putin's inability to accomplish this impossible mission is not solely due to the United States. Recently, European actors have been putting heavy embargoes on Moscow in order to end the most striking war of the century that has plunged the Eastern Bloc into chaos, which Russian leader Vladimir Putin sees as an auction. The total number of sanctions imposed on Russia since the pre-war has reached 14,022. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, is putting forward danger elements such as China and North Korea to raise the price of the auction against this record number of sanctions. But the Beijing government wants to support Putin with a shadow effect, just as Iran hides its military aid to Russia and does not make these aids permanent. As the reaction against Russia rises in Europe, Chinese leader Xi stands behind Putin and defends unexpected arguments such as that this war has damaged the world. However, the USA again appears as the most effective deterrent against Russia's double gains gods of war like M1, Abrams battle tanks, Hatred, air defense systems, and the U.S. Navy's sharp roots in areas such as the Pacific and Arctic seas prevent Russia and China from getting any closer together. In addition to the USA, the Baltic countries, and other world countries that support Ukraine's freedom struggle continue to be a serious deterrent for Russia and China. These countries continue to impose suffocating restrictions and economic sanctions, as we've mentioned, often to discourage Russian leader Vladimir Putin and his allies from war. The Czech Republic, rather than the countries we have mentioned regarding sanctions against Russia in the last few days, has managed to stand out much more by signing a first in history. The Czech Republic, which borders Poland in the north, Germany in the west, and northwest Austria in the south, and Slovakia in the east, announced that it started to impose sanctions against the Russian Federation for the first time last day. Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala said in a statement that Czech authorities had frozen millions of euros in assets of Russian businessmen. These statements actually meant that the Czech Republic openly warned the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, directly. Besides taking sanctions, you know that the Czech Republic was the first country to provide tank support to Ukraine, continuing to support Ukraine in the face of Russia's attacks. The Czech Republic, by signing a first, decide to send many unused T-72 type tanks and BVP-1 type armored vehicles in the army inventory to Ukraine. In addition, the Czech Republic has so far sent 30,000 pistols, 7,000 rifles, 3,000 machine guns, nearly 100 sniper rifles, approximately 1 million rounds, and 4.6 152mm squared artillery shells to Ukraine. In addition to these aids, especially recently, the Czech Republic has provided aid to Ukraine in the amount of 60 million euros consisting of heavy weapons. But the current agenda of the Czechs is to end this war with economic sanctions against Russia as well as military support to the Ukrainian army. Of course, there was an important reason why the Czechs signed such a historic sanction decision to end this war, especially recently with the expansion of NATO and the joining of a new military power like Finland into the international alliance. As the 31st member, European countries have started to take much more bold steps against Russia. The Czech Republic is one of the countries that shows that the USA has done its part in this strategy that aims to gather the world under a single roof. Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipovsky made critical statements on this issue. Jan Lipovsky reported that the violence perpetuated by the Russian army in Ukraine cannot be justified by faith. The Czech authorities were giving shock after shock to Russian leader Putin with their rhetoric for the first time. In addition, these striking statements had wide repercussions on the world agenda because after the sanctions decisions of the Czech Republic, it is estimated that both Europe and other world countries will stand much more upright against Russian leader Vladimir Putin's harsh and aggressive policies. The Czech Republic did not just impose economic sanctions on Russia. Czech parliamentary officials proposed a remarkable study of controlling EU politicians and members of EU institutions to counter Russian interference in the 2024 European Parliament elections. According to this study proposed by the Czechs, the EU office, every politician and representative in its institutions should be followed. Any questionable legislative initiative should be monitored and investigated. This bold proposal of the Czechs has been appreciated by the whole world political arena. After the former vice president of the European Parliament, the representative of Germany, Katarina Barley, called against Russian interference in the European Parliament elections in 2024. As a matter of fact, this suggestion of the Czechs makes a lot of sense because the EU needs to learn from its mistakes in Russian interference in the 2019 European Parliament elections and broaden its view on both the threat and the methodology of this interference. For this reason, this study proposal presented by the Czech Republic should start as soon as possible. On the other hand, Putin is expected to approach China, which he sees as an ally, with the Czech Republic joining the caravan of countries that impose sanctions against Russia. However, Czechs have an interesting approach in this regard as well. Czech President Petr Pavel, a former NATO general, believes that China cannot be trusted to keep peace between Russia and Ukraine. Pavel argues that China has taken advantage of the war too much to play its peaceful role. It was quite remarkable that the Czech president's comments came after China, which had recently drawn an uncertain roadmap to end the conflict, suddenly started to defend the world order because the Beijing administration is currently trying to position itself as a mediator and peace ambassador in Ukraine. While most Western allies are skeptical of Beijing's bids for peace, some countries insist that China can play an important role in peace talks. However, Pavel, a former general and senior NATO leader, thinks that when it comes to Ukraine, China only wants the best for itself. And for now, it's more of a mind game. There are also statements by the Czech president that prove that the strategy implemented by China is purely a deception and a conflict of interest. If you remember recently, Petr Pavel suggested that when tensions in the world were so high, Beijing could get cheap oil, gas, and other resources from Moscow in exchange for its unlimited partnership with the Kremlin. Pavel's words seemed prescient when, just hours after his speech, the Chinese ambassador to France aroused indignation by declaring that the former Soviet countries had no effective status in international law. In fact, France had responded harshly to Russia's occupation policies towards Ukraine. However, Pavel's latest statements on this issue pointed out that this stance of France was insufficient and that the leader of the Paris government, Emmanuel Macron, should take much tougher sanctions against Putin. While Beijing shunned Pavel's statements, the incident sparked a heated conversation about whether China could help bring peace to Ukraine. On the other hand, while NATO countries were discussing the future of their current goal of spending 2% of their economic output on defense, Pavel argued that the allies should focus on what their armies can actually do rather than how much money is spent on paper. According to the former Czech general, the allies need to focus more on their military capabilities and ensure they have highly prepared and well-equipped forces. At the same time, the Czech president spoke directly about his fears about the rise of populism and the growing Russian influence around the Czech Republic. The Czech president suggested that the Ukrainian army should be supported much more militarily and financially in this regard. As of February 22, 2022, the country that took the most sanctions against Russia was the USA with 1948 sanctions, Switzerland with 1782 sanctions, Canada with 1590 sanctions, the United Kingdom with 1429 sanctions, the European Union with 1390 sanctions, France with 1324 sanctions, Australia with 945 sanctions, and Japan with 919 sanctions, followed by the USA. As of that date, 9,117 of the sanctions against Russia have been applied to individuals, while 290 have targeted organizations. 96 have targeted ships and 24 have targeted aircraft. In summary, when we consider all these events, we witness once again that the threats that countries such as Russia and China are trying to create are really ineffective against the countries of the world, getting closer to a single goal. We hope that all countries will remain united in this way against Russia trying to get the support of China to cause disasters in Ukraine and all over the world. Some crucial truths are never hidden. And no matter how hard you try to hide the bad news in a war, it will eventually break out somewhere. In fact, we have been seeing the effects of this word for a long time in the ongoing war on Ukrainian soil. To this day, the Russians have consistently preferred to hide their military losses in the war. Moscow authorities are not very skilled in this regard. In addition, the Russian Ministry of Defense never reflects the truth on this issue with the comical figures it shares. But the striking evidence that emerges reveals the truth behind the scenes that the Russians hide the loss of 4 warships in one day by the Russian Navy is one of them. The fact that the Russians have lost their Navy power one by one in recent days has drawn all the attention in this direction. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in his speech to graduates of the Odessa Maritime Academy, has already repeatedly stated that Russian ships know what awaits them in Ukrainian waters. Zelensky, who thanked the Ukrainian Navy officers for protecting the Ukrainian state in the maritime defense sector, added that Ukraine needs victory at sea, on land, and in the air against the Russians. In fact, the Russian ships had already lost their only chance in Ukrainian waters. Russia's Black Sea flagship had already seen what any ship threatening Ukraine would face, and the loss of the Moscow ship was indeed revealing the whole situation. In addition, the Ukrainian Defense and Security Forces had long ago proven definitively that the Ukrainian Snake Island would not tolerate the Russian flag. All these details were enough to prove that Russia had serious problems with the Navy. But according to the Russians, there were still no big problems in this regard until the hidden truths come to the surface. In this video, we will share the shocking details of the very heavy loss of the Russian Navy. The Russians managed to hide the facts on this issue for a full year. But after 1 year, everything turned out. Now, without wasting any time, let's discover this truth which has been tried to be hidden for a very long time. If you remember, Ukrainian forces destroyed the Russian fleet in Berdyansk with a striking missile attack at the beginning of the war, while Russia claimed that no navy was damaged after this attack. The Ukrainians thought otherwise. Over time, it turned out that the suspicions of the Ukrainians on this issue were quite justified. A year after the attack, shocking evidence emerged about the missile attacks on Berdyansk from Ukraine's military wing. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, posted a clip on his Telegram channel in which he stated that a year ago, on March 24, 2022, Ukrainian soldiers destroyed the Russian ship Saratov in the port of Zaporizhia Oblast in the city of Berdyansk. The video was shared with the public after the confession of a Russian admiral who 4 months denied that the Saratov ship had sunk. These shocking images brought to light the striking facts that the Russians are trying to hide. In addition, in this attack, 3 more Russian ships in addition to Saratov became unusable. Other Russian ships that were excluded from the Navy after the attack were identified as Orsk, Caesar, Kunikov, and Novokirksk. While these ships were heavily damaged, the Navy ship Saratov was completely destroyed, according to the post shared by the Ukrainian Armed Forces. In the description of the video, it says that the legend of the invincibility of the Russian fleet was destroyed by well-meaning attacks. It turned out that the statement belonged to the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny once again proved an irrefutable truth with a stunning video he shared. This fact was that the Russians could not win either on the territory of Ukraine in the air or in the water. Russia acknowledged the loss of Saratov only on the first anniversary of the ship's destruction, when Felix Menkov, the commander of the Crimean naval base in Sevastopol, appointed by Russia, unveiled a plaque commemorating the killed sailors. Already the video footage of Valery Zaluzhny proved everything, but the Russians tried to hide this fact as much as they could. In the aforementioned commemoration ceremony, the Russians shared critical details about this issue with the press, as well as admitting that they lost the ship Saratov a year ago. The Russians also lost the crews of the battleship Saratov, Novokirksk, and Caesar Kunikov, according to the Crimean Real news source. In other words, according to the statements shared by Russian sources, a total of 4 Russian ships and their crews were completely erased from history. Russian media outlet noted that this is the first official confirmation that the ship was lost in battle after reports of the ships being hit by Ukrainian missiles were denied for a year. In short, the Russians were in a position where they could no longer hide some facts about the war. Also, the U.S. company Maxar Technologies released satellite images of the destroyed Saratov landing craft showing the proximity of their tax-fueled facilities. According to Ukrainska Pravda, this landing craft was removed after the attack and taken to the Crimea for repairs. On the other hand, the Ukrainian news outlet reported that the commanders of the 2 landing craft damaged in Berdyansk were declared traitors to Ukraine because they took refuge in Russia in 2014. The sinking of Saratov occurred soon after Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This critical situation occurred 3 weeks before the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva, was destroyed in an attack that brought a PR blow to Ukraine. These heavy naval losses of Russia had already greatly affected the situation around the Berdyansk port and the city. Now Russian forces are unable to accept the possibility of Ukrainian advances around this area, continue to attack civilian Ukrainian targets in and around Berdyansk. In fact, Russia continues its civilian attacks not only in Berdyansk, but throughout Ukraine. After the Russians lost these 4 ships, the number of casualties in the Russian Navy increased to 18. For this reason, the Russians continue to ruthlessly attack military and civilian targets on the territory of Ukraine with the greed of these losses. The Ukrainian armed forces have serious defense plans in this regard. The Ukrainian military could do much more damage to the Russian Navy, and Russian military resources in the Black Sea could be heavily targeted by the Ukrainians for this. Ukraine's newly acquired fighter jets and the 240-kilometer range Harpoon missiles are important. President Joe Biden reports that the United States prefers to provide the Ukrainian military with ample weapons, ammunition, and artillery and defense systems. McRaven, a retired major general in the Australian Army, stated that the Ukrainian army is currently the best in the world, partly because of the weapons supplied by NATO countries and the experience they gained in the last 13 months, thanks to the military aid provided to the Ukrainian army. It is thought that Russia will lose much more naval power in this war. In addition to these military supports, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to develop their army in the military field with the regulations and innovations they carry out within themselves. Another reason why Russia lost so many ships and boats is that Ukraine has brought itself to a very high level in terms of unmanned aerial vehicles. Yes, it is vital that the US and Western partners support Ukraine militarily, but the Ukrainian military is. Development in drone strikes ensures that Crimea and its surroundings are constantly targeted by Ukrainians. In the future, it's expected that the Ukrainian forces will make much more critical moves in the war, thanks to the military support they receive, and continue to develop themselves in the military field. Sharking operation by the Ukrainian army. Russia's last open back wound was blown up. The force laid on the train tracks literally cornered Putin. After that, Russian soldiers waiting for a shipment to Bakhmut were at a loss. What to do? The Ukrainian army took this opportunity to consolidate its dominance in Bakhmut and began preparations to deal the biggest blow to the Russian army in the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Putin began to suffer one defeat after another. There are many reasons for these defeats, but the most important reason is the strengthening of the Ukrainian army's grip on the region. Ukrainian soldiers began to blow up convoys of ammunition and supplies, so each of the Russian military headquarters in the region. With this move, the Russian army began to face enormous difficulties. The solution to the situation, which caused great unrest within the army, came from Putin again. But when Ukraine became aware of this last hope, the Russian army was dealt another blow. Although the Ukrainian army has been developing in many areas recently, it has come to a completely different point, especially in the field of intelligence. This is based on the training of many countries that know the vulnerabilities of the Russian army well. The Ukrainian army, which receives training from the world's best countries in the field of intelligence, such as the USA and Israel, seems to have literally infiltrated the Russians. Thanks to this last step, a huge blow was dealt to the Russian presence in the Ukrainian region. This blow was dealt to Russia's last hope, the ammunition train. According to the information obtained by the Ukrainian army from the Russian agents, Russia was going to send a very large ammunition train to the Ukrainian region in a short time. Upon receiving the news of this, the Ukrainian army immediately took action and started to draw possible routes in the region. These were the areas where the railroad was located and where Russia had a serious shortage of ammunition. At this point, there were only two countries left. One of them was Soledar and the other was Bakhmut, which Putin was very stubborn about. But when the Ukrainian army realized that there was more ammunition shortage in Bakhmut due to the hot conflict, they immediately took action. Thanks to the many maps drawn earlier, the Ukrainian army knew which headquarters were located near the trains. Therefore, the Ukrainian army drove an unthinkable operation plan and started to move towards the region. The most elite units of the Ukrainian army were mobilized for this operation. Among them were the Ukrainian Special Forces. When the news that the Russian train was on its way, the unthinkable plan was put into action. Ukrainian Special Forces realized that some of the train tracks in this area were too maneuverable. The Ukrainian army had completed the first stage of the plan to derail the train by lining up C4s on the slightly sloppy areas. In the second stage, it deployed a large number of soldiers right on the train tracks, preparing them especially for a possible rocket attack. As a result of this preparation, Ukrainian soldiers are waiting to deliver the strongest blow to the heart of the Russian army. The Ukrainian Special Forces scout units started to wait about 1 kilometer behind hearing the sound of the train. The team signaled the Ukrainian army to take their positions with the signal. Ukrainian soldiers completed their preparations. The Russian train slowly started heading towards the area where the remote control forts were located. As the train was passing over the forts, a huge explosion occurred. The crew on the train was surprised. Although the first two wagons survived and continued on their way, the main ammunition was in the rear wagons. When the train derailed, the Ukrainian army immediately headed towards the ammunition. The Russian soldiers and the carriage who managed to escape could not fully recover from the shock of the incident. Unable even to get to the radio, the Russian soldiers were identified by a nearby headquarters as having been attacked, but the Ukrainian army was prepared for this. It quickly began loading all the ammunition it could get onto the trucks it had brought with it. The Barracudas patrolling this area informed the Ukrainian army of the approach of the Russian soldiers. After that, the Ukrainian army immediately started to move away from that area. But before this move, they started the remaining C4s they had in their heads in the section where the explosive ammunition they left behind so that the Russian army could not take them. This was one of the strongest points of the Ukrainian army's operation. This time, the explosives created a huge explosion. Exactly 1 hour later, after these developments, Putin went crazy with anger when he heard about this victory of the Ukrainian army, and he made decisions that will confuse the whole world. It was well known that Russia has been in a very bad political predicament lately. But Putin's actions, which have become more and more belligerent as he has lost the war, have put Russia's relations with the rest of the world and its place in foreign policy in serious trouble. At the heart of it all was that the fact that Putin was now completely out of control after the failure in Ukraine. Putin became very hostile to the countries that supported Ukraine, especially. His latest decision caused a lot of trouble. Putin decided to sign certain agreements with Belarus in order to intimidate Ukraine and the whole world. The basis of these agreements was to send nuclear missiles to Belarus. This would bring Russia closer to Europe and create huge tensions. Someone had to put a stop to Putin, whose threats in this region were growing more and more. That's why more and more countries started to support Ukraine. Many countries started to think not only about the economic dimension of this war, but also about the peace it would disrupt all over the world. Then the attitude towards the war changed. The Russian army had to deal with huge tension. The fact that many of the countries supporting Ukraine were superpowers and that the ammunition being sent was a very different nature increased the tension within the military. But especially Ukraine's latest move has once again exposed the fractures within the army. Putin's political troubles have begun to reverberate around the world, but it was not fully known how much this was reflected in the army. The presence of very different groups within the army ensured that not enough success was achieved in this region. Now that the Ukrainian army has taken the lead in many areas, these groups have started to have great conflicts with each other. After that, The inability to unite in the Russian army ensured that the operations organized by Ukraine were successful. Russian soldiers who are so far apart are now expected to face greater tensions. With the recent advantages gained by Ukraine, three groups within the Russian army started to exhibit different attitudes towards each other. The most prominent of these groups are inexperienced Russian soldiers, followed by Chechens and other minority groups. However, the Wagner mercenary group is considered to be the main problematic group in the Russian army. Many convicted soldiers in Wagner are fighting for their freedom, but they do not refrain from displaying a very different attitude on the battlefield in relation to the reasons for their previous imprisonment. Because of this, the people in the Ukrainian territory are very angry against Wagner and the Russian army. The Russian army, which looted heavily in the villages they captured, has made the people sick to death. After that, even the reactions of the Ukrainian people have reached a level that can cause great damage to the Russian army. If it continues in this way, Ukraine is expected to regain control of these regions in a very short time. This is also the reason why the Russian army has been unable to maintain continuity in many areas. Russian soldiers who loot and pillage everywhere they enter treat the people of this region very harshly. This lays the foundation for the invasion attempts not to be permanent. In response, it has become quite easy for Ukraine to dominate Russia. With the situation as it is, the Russian army is now expected to face greater tensions. Ukrainian soldiers have now literally cornered the Russians. And thanks to Zelensky's latest steps, the entire Russian army is expected to be expelled from the territory in a short time.